What we've got here is a double trunk redwood tree, and if you look way up in the center there, way in the middle between the two unions, you can see an additional trunk starting to form. Now that additional trunk in the middle there is going to continue to get bigger and bigger, and the expansion of that trunk is going to create a weakness on the two large ones. So that in essence is working a bit like a jack, trying to force those two other tops apart. So I notice there's one on both sides. So those inside new growth tops need to come out of there. I would also recommend a cable way up high, about 3/4 of the way up the top of the tree. A redwood tree is always best if it's a single leader, but it's common to see double leaders. And the decision to put a cable is generally based upon the weakness that you can identify at the union.
148 Castilian.
Okay. We've got a redwood tree over here that has a double top on it. And I don't know how well you can see through the branches here, but you can see that there was another top that came through the center that is completely decayed. And the narrowing down on the trunk on the left-hand side is very, very thin. So there's an awful lot of weight being exerted or being put on that pressure point right there. And I think with the decay from that centerpiece, you've got a significant weakness. So this is a tree that I would not recommend cabling. I'd recommend removing this tree because there really isn't any way to minimize that weakness. That's a severe enough weakness that you've got a hazardous tree. There's a little better view of that. That's a fairly wide Y, but the center stuff that comes down the middle is completely dead. So as that rots away, that's creating a void at the union of those two trunks. Double trunk redwood trees are common, and they're not necessarily dangerous, but they are always more of a hazard than a single leader. So you have to take each individual tree and inspect it and look at it as an individual and make your decision to put a cable on the union that you see. Now I found a liquid amber with a similar type of a situation, but they're smaller trunks, but the inclusion, the bark inclusion here is much more severe, and this tree is very likely going to split. The likelihood of this portion here splitting off is very real, but as you come down it comes to a main union, and as you can see in here there is a weakness. In a good windstorm, this tree will likely end up on that house over there. I found another liquid amber over by unit 123, and it has a tight inclusion as well, and you can see all the way through here. As this gets bigger and this gets bigger, it's going to force it to split. But the big thing that I did notice is this opening in here. At one time there was some sort of damage. A branch ripped off, something happened. So I've got this little probe here, and as I put it in, it goes in, I can feel it going into soft, punky wood, and now it stops. So I pulled it out. It goes in a solid 8 inches. So this whole area right in here is a weakness, and this tree is definitely going to fall apart. When it's going to fall apart is anybody's guess, but this, I would classify this as a fairly extreme hazard. And over at 117 Castilian we have yet another double trunk redwood tree. And this tree, the foliage on it is quite sparse. It's only got about half the foliage that it should have. The browning in the center is not a major concern because at this time of the year you've always got some internal dieback. But what I am a little concerned with is the remaining portions should be much thicker and much denser. I should not be able to see so much blue sky through the tree when I look up. So I look down at the base of the tree, and I'm making an educated guess here, but I believe that at one time somebody came along and did some fairly significant root severing, and the new growth has grown over these cut roots, and that's part of the reason that it looks this way. And if that's the case, you may have some decay that's going up through the severed roots. Now this is just a guess, but it's based upon the way it looks. Generally, when you have a tree as close to the sidewalk as this, the roots get underneath it and start lifting it, and it just seems to be too sheer of a delineation, of a defining separation here. So if you're going to keep the tree, it definitely needs a cable, and I'd go up about 2/3 the way on this tree. Every once in a while you run across a redwood tree that has an anomaly in its trunk development. In this case, you can see that it's very, very swollen, and in some places it almost looks like a pregnant tree. And if you compare it to the redwood adjacent to it that has a very symmetrical trunk, you can see that it is a considerable anomaly. The reason for this is really difficult. Some people say they're burrow growths. There are some trunk cankers that redwood trees will develop. In this case, it does look like it's a bit of a swelling. I wouldn't be too worried about it because the color of the foliage still looks really good. It may very well tolerate it for a long, long time, but when I see a situation like this, it's always something to pay attention to. Now here's a location where there's a redwood tree very, very close to the walkway, and you can see part of the walkway has been replaced. What I'm a little bit concerned about is the way that this redwood tree has grown. Appears like at one time somebody came along and cut a lot of roots. And 20, 25, 30 years ago, that was a very common practice to come in with a stump grinder or a root pruner and cut off everything along the sidewalks. The new growth appears to have encapsulated these old wounds, if there are in fact wounds. I'm guessing here, but it's definitely an abnormal development for a redwood tree. The redwood tree should have completely busted out this sidewalk and filled in on this area. The sidewalk is not strong enough to inhibit the development of this trunk, so that's what leads me to think that there may have been some cutting here. I got a redwood tree over here that's got ivy climbing all the way up. Now ivy is really, really hard to get rid of. It's got little roots that actually embed themselves into the bark. So my recommendation here would be to cut all the vines down low and let all this die so that it comes off easier. It's a real challenge to get it out. If you forget about this, in a few years' time, it'll grow all the way up to the top and right out the branches, and it'll be an impossible job. So get the ivy out of the tree. Over by unit number 193, there's a large liquid amber, and you can see there is a major split that will come apart and it will fall on the building. Unfortunately, both of these are going to need to come out, and that's going to leave this tree somewhat imbalanced. So I think you're going to have to take off an equal amount of foliage on this side. I think in the long run it'll be good for the tree, but because of that one defect, you're forced to do something a little bit radical on this tree. Okay, this is actually at the adjacent complex, but there's an Italian alder that has a significant weakness all the way to the ground. It's a fairly large tree, and years ago somebody recognized that this was a weakness and they put a cable between these two. But the cable installation is very, very old. You can no longer see the attachment points. As old as that cable is, it is very likely at a point where it's got some metal fatigue in there, and a secondary backup cable, I believe, is very, very important. With this weakness down here, that cable is probably the only thing holding this tree together. If that metal has gotten old enough and is fatigued and suddenly breaks, and I see that happen, as it breaks, this side of the tree will suddenly go down and it may clip the edge of the building.